Good evening. My name is James Kim. Welcome to the Asan Plenum 2018 evening session. I believe this is the first one that we've ever had an evening session. And it's entitled Values Diplomacy. Joining us tonight are four individuals with diverse backgrounds and experience, starting with Patrick Cronin, who is the Senior Advisor and Director of Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Previously, he was also the Director of INSS at the National Defense University and the Director of Studies at IISS, as well as the Senior Vice President at CSIS. Michael Green is a Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. Most notably, he served as the Director of Asian Affairs on the National Security Council and as a Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and as Senior Director for Asia during the first George W. Bush administration. Takako Hikotani is a Gerald L. Curtis Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University. Previously, she was the Associate Professor at the National Defense Academy of Japan and held positions at the Air Defense Forces Staff Colleges and the National Institute for Defense Studies in Japan. Finally, but not last, James Steinberg is the Professor of Social Science and International Affairs and Law at Syracuse University, where he was also the Dean of the Maxwell School during 2011 and 2016, to 2016. He also served as the Principal Deputy Secretary to Secretary Hillary Clinton during the first Obama administration, and also as the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton during his second term. Our goal in the next 80 minutes or so is to tap the wisdom and experience of these individuals to address an age-old question about the role of values in diplomacy. The debate is a recurring one in history, which have challenged leaders as they struggle to define their foreign policy. Will nation-states' engagement with others be defined primarily by their values, or should they be defined by their national interest? History has shown us that different leaders have staked out different positions on this question. For instance, we can look to President Woodrow Wilson, who called for a world made safe for democracy, or President Jimmy Carter, who declared that human rights is the soul of American foreign policy in a White House speech commemorating the 30th anniversary of UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1978. Of course, this kind of thinking is not restricted to the United States. We know of William Gladstone's moral imperative for liberty, which is a good parallel example from Great Britain. We can contrast this approach with others like John Quincy Adams, who is mentioned in Michael Green's new book, which I have here, and which they're going to present tomorrow. You should read it. It's very good. As you know, John Quincy Adams as having asserted, and I quote Michael Green here, even though he could probably speak for this himself, quote, "American primacy in the Pacific Northwest is America's gateway to the Pacific." Or Benjamin Disraeli, again from Great Britain, was solely concerned about the preservation of the British Empire. President Trump seems completely focused on making America great and keeping it that way. Though the keynote this morning by Ed Fulner suggests a more sophisticated formulation. Other leaders even appear genuinely conflicted between these two principles. And President Barack Obama, for instance, seems to have oscillated between realism and idealism in what a British historian, David Milne, has referred to as transcendent pragmatism, or what some others would simply call contradiction. So let me begin today with Michael Green, who has given some thought to this topic already in many of his writings. You note in a paper you co-authored with Dan Twining in 2009, and I'm quoting here, "The history of American foreign policy is often framed by realists in terms of values versus interests. You seem to have a more evolved formulation in your new book, as tension between self-determination and universal values. I think these dichotomies can also apply to Europe, as we saw in Disraeli and Gladstone, who I've mentioned. Can you maybe perhaps set the baseline for us by providing some historical examples about how values and interests have defined foreign policy among Western powers? And if I can push you a little further, can you also talk about some instances where one takes precedence over the other? Michael?
Thank you. This is an important topic, and I'm impressed so many of you have come at 9:15 to talk about democracy. It shows we're winning. The question of whether there's a dichotomy between our interests and our values is one that interests me a great deal. When I was a graduate student at SAIS in the 80s, I studied under Robert Osgood, who was one of the leading thinkers on post-war realist thought in foreign affairs, a Hans Morgenthau student. He was my advisor, and he wrote a famous book called Self-Interests and Idealism in American Foreign Policy, and he argued that there's a difference between interests and idealism. And being a bright-eyed graduate student, I thought that made sense. And then I studied Asian studies, and the dominant thinkers at the time were people like Lucian Pai and others who in the mid-'80s wrote books about the Asian models of authoritarianism and how it was part of the Confucius worldview in this part of the world to not want democracy, and that democracy was not as natural. And for Asian studies, which is all about getting a certificate if you spoke Chinese or Korean or Japanese in explaining the inscrutable Asians, it was kind of a self-serving argument in retrospect to say you can't really understand Asia if you try to impose Western values. So that's what I was steeped in from 1985 to 1987. And then, having studied that realism and idealism are different, that the leading thinkers in Asian studies said that Asian people don't naturally take to democracy, graduated, got my master's in 87, and over the next year, Korea, Taiwan, Philippines democratized. I thought, wait a minute. And so it struck me as odd. We did surveys at CSIS in 2009 and 2015 where we asked about 1,000 foreign policy elites in 10 Asian countries what norms, what values should inform the integration of Asia. And we had about 15 different norms. And good governance, free and fair elections, human rights, and rule of law, and women's empowerment were at the top of the list for most of the democracies in this region, as you might expect. And pretty important countries, India, Japan, Korea, the Philippines. Now, the caveat was when we asked how important is the concept of non-interference in internal affairs, India, Thailand, Indonesia, the sort of post-colonial states, track more with China and thinking, don't tell us what to do. So I don't want to give the impression there's this huge democratic consensus out here, but it was clearly seen as important to success in some of the most important countries. So I think we as a country need to get past, especially in the academy, this sort of post-war anti-Wilsonian pushback that Robert Osgood and Henry Kissinger and others championed, and realize that interests and values are not mutually contradictory. And I'll just briefly end by saying this really came home to me when I researched and wrote this book, because going back to Thomas Jefferson, Alfred Thayer Mahan, John Quincy Adams, among others, when Americans looked at the Pacific, they were looking at a region of declining empire. We became a power in the Pacific as the Qing Empire was collapsing. And this was a region for the 250 years we've engaged it as a republic, where the definition of the nation state was up for grabs. And Thomas Jefferson, Perry, Mahan recognized, George Shultz recognized that states that were well governed, that were legitimate, that were republics, were going to be much more resilient in the face of imperial powers trying to encroach on Asia, Japanese imperialism, And so it was realism, it was self-interest to support well-governed democratic states that are resilient. Now, we were frequently hypocritical. The first American commissioners sent to China in 1784 were ordered not to tell the Celestial Empire that we were a republic. They were just to tell them that we had won our independence from the hated British, and China can be independent from the British too if they trade with us. So we've hardly been consistent or free of hypocrisy. But I think the history lesson is really important now, because as China starts to build influence through the Belt and Road, which involves a lot of money, but also a lot of corruption, a lot of debt traps, a lot of non-transparent lending, we should be increasingly, we the democracy should be increasingly championing these same norms, because that is our best defense against a region that falls under an illiberal hegemony, because smaller states are easily coerced, bribed, and so shining a light, free press, good governance, civil society, defensively now, these are really, really important principles for us to champion in this region, I would say.
So how about you, Patrick? I mean, do you see a dichotomy between values and interests, or is it, as Michael puts it, it's all different? It's about interests ultimately at the end of the day, or these values and interests essentially go together. How do you see this? And secondly, some people would argue that promoting certain kinds of values puts nation states at a disadvantage compared to other states that don't promote specific kinds of idealistic values. Like, let's say, and I'm thinking of cases like China and Russia. Do you agree with that thinking as well?
Well, it's an important set of questions, but it is complicated. It depends on where you sit and what you're trying to achieve. And if you're interested in policy, especially in the United States, you are always making compromises. You're always trying to find what's the right balance to have do the most good, but also to pursue the national interest. And sometimes you are on the side of human rights, and sometimes you are on the side of just raw interests. It really depends on what's at stake and who is making the decision and how much leverage you have and autonomy you have to make a decision. When you're in policy, especially at lower levels, even assistant secretary levels, you're not really an independent agent. National security advisors are not independent agents. They work for a principle, and you are executing policy rather than having an academic debate about it. So even if you care deeply about something, it may not be the direct approach. You maybe have to take an indirect approach. Often, though, governments are not necessarily the answer. We heard this from Jim Steinberg this morning on a related issue. One of the most trenchant things I did when I was assistant administrator at U.S. Agency for International Development was to go up to northern Uganda into the camps where they had recovered child soldiers from Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army. And it was Save the Children. It was a non-governmental organization, a charity, that was doing this heroic work on the ground. It wasn't me. The government was giving money, modest sums of money, but most of it was coming through private charities. And here they were essentially rehabilitating children barely in their teens who had already been forced to execute family members, had been drugged, given guns, had now been rescued. Some had eyes gouged out, and they were looking for a purpose, looking whether they could go back to their village in Gulu. I mean, so I'm just talking about the power of civil society and non-governmental organization, or free press. These are the powerful institutions that really speak much louder and greater truths than the government sometimes can do this. We see this in the Philippines right now. It's not politic to talk about extrajudicial killing if you're trying to make sure that the Chinese don't just wholesale take over a relationship with the Philippines, but it's an awful human rights tragedy. The good thing is the Philippines is a democracy still, and there are institutions and other ways to get in and to permeate that policy. So there are always workarounds, essentially, even when you have to compromise maybe the best approach, the most direct approach. I do think that whatever personal values you take into the government, though, you are ultimately there to serve a national interest. And so interests, especially in high policy, especially if you're dealing with the high politics of what might be at stake, you're making bigger compromises. But that doesn't mean you do nothing. It just means you may have to do your work differently when it comes to human rights and it comes to democracy. There's no values-free policy, by the way, and I think Mike was just getting to the tip of the iceberg when he talked about corruption, the sort of the unwritten rules of some of the indebtedness. Dagong credit rating, run by China, rates 90 countries a year, and they claim that they have different ratings from Standards & Poor's and Moody's because they're looking for places where there's economic opportunity to grow. In reality, they're looking for and favoring authoritarian governments. And we just came from China, where we had a discussion about a lot of economic differences on trade policy. And when you scratch beneath the surface on this issue with a lot of the Chinese, it's about protecting the Communist Party. And it may not be communism, but there's a value there, that they are protecting the party. And that's why they claim that they need Made in China 2025 goals, because it's a national goal to get to 2049 in the Xi era. Okay, well, there are values, and there are people who are going to be affected by those values, and it's important for the United States and for democracies like Korea and Japan and others, Australia, to stand up for those values. But how we intervene in the affairs of others, there's where we have to be careful, and there's where America has become too much the proselytizer or too interventionist at times. But sometimes we've done too little. I mean, last August, we could have leaned much more on the generals in Burma to try to prevent what became a horrific exodus of nearly 700,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh, and the human atrocities and tragedy that's still gripping a lot of this sort of stateless people. So there are things that we can do, even when you're trying to be a balanced, prudent policymaker to balance interests and values.
So Patrick talks about values, but what kinds of values? And I think that some people would argue that U.S. has typically tended towards, I think, Mike, you talked about this, something called universal value, right? There are certain kinds of universal values. For instance, democracy, as some people would argue, is a universal. Amartya Sen would argue that that's a universal value. And so there's a tendency towards gravitating towards a particular kind of value in the case of the United States and many Western powers that you don't see in other cases like Russia or China, for instance. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the view that a society or a government has towards values, whether they're universal or not, has a lot to do with power struggles they're in, domestically and in the region. And in the 80s, for example, it was not uncommon for the Japanese government or the Korean government before democratization to argue that Asian values are different. Because at that time, the driving concern was that the U.S. was going to force the Anglo-American, Washington consensus on these economies that were increasingly under friction with the U.S. But now, in Japanese foreign policy, since around 2001, democratic values, universal norms is emphasized, and in Korea too, increasingly. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that exceptionalism, Asian values, are not so useful when China is starting to export a value system that's more threatening. So how governments frame these have to do with the threats they perceive domestically and externally. And clearly Putin has a major internal threat that he fears. And as Patrick was saying, for the Chinese Communist Party, they're concerned about legitimacy. So how you define values, whether universal or exceptional, it always has a lot to do with the power dynamic and threat and competition you're in. But at the end of the day, I do think there are certain truths that are self-evident. We can't, they're going to fit differently in different cultures. Aung San Suu Kyi, when he was premier, gave a speech in the UN where he said that Korea was the embodiment of Asian heritage and universal democratic values. And he was framing it in a way that was very Korean. but acknowledge these truths that were so important to Korea's democracy. And so that kind of, we need to protect a diversity of views on how these values are moved forward, but there are certain, I think, self-evident truths, as the Founding Fathers said.
So, Jim, you've had quite a bit of experience in government. What's your view on this? Is there a certain set of values that, in your experience in American foreign policy, that U.S. has a tendency to promote? And if so, or if there isn't, is this a disadvantage for the U.S.?
Quite the opposite. I think it is our great advantage. I think that it is for almost everything that we want to achieve. Our effectiveness stems from the fact that our policy is rooted in values. I think it's notable and disturbing that when the one time that President Trump got an applause when he went to the UN is when he stood up at the UN and he said, "I put America first, just like all the rest of you put your countries first." And there was universal applause there, including by the most authoritarian states sitting in the UN, because it's over for us if we equate ourselves as just another state pursuing our own national interest with disregard to broader sets of broader interests and broader human interest. I think there's obviously a vigorous debate, and we've begun to explore some of the dimensions about exactly how you pursue this. But it is what makes us an important player on the international stage. It's not, as people always say, the idea of our power, but the power of ideas. And it has made it possible for the United States to be influential because others understand that we are not doing it at their expense. It's the difference between being a colonial and an imperial power and an organizer of an international system that has a broader conception of what the interest is. And so in that sense, I think the view that there is not an inherent tension between values and interests is quite clear, and especially for a powerful country like the United States. There are enough of you all who've done the IR stuff here. Countries balance against countries that are a threat to them, but they bandwagon with those that they think are on their side. And I think the reason we've been successful up to now, with all the mistakes and hypocrisies that Mike correctly points us to, is that on the whole, people have trusted us to use our power in a broader context. And that's not a sacrifice, as President Trump seems to think. It's actually in our interest, and we benefit from that. So I think it's really critical that to walk away from that is the game is over for us, because if we're just like China and Russia, then why should anybody care? And why shouldn't they simply sort of see that the Chinese order could be just as good as the American order, if that's how we conceive of the international system or how we use our power? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have to be sensitive to diversity and different perspectives. And especially going to your first question, I think it's very important for Americans to realize that there are universal values that aren't just the political and civil rights, right? There are two UN covenants, right? One is the political and civil rights, but the other is on social and economic rights. And those are important, and we have to recognize that. And we begin to lose the argument if we think that it's only about political liberty. We have to care about and appreciate the fact that many countries, especially developing countries, have to worry about that it's all well and good to talk about individual liberty, but if people are starving, if they don't have health care, if they don't have opportunity, those things don't mean much. And so we have to accept the idea that the panoply of rights is broader, and that in the pursuit of our favored rights, which seem to be the political and civil rights, that we should not be dismissive of these other important things, both for our own people, frankly, but also for others. And so the universality is important, but we can't pick and choose among the universal principles either. And I think some sensitivity to that, and to see this through the eyes of others, and the complex relationship between development and political and civil liberty in particular, is one that we have to be sensitive to. But it can't be from walking away from that core commitment. And frankly, I think one can point to John Quincy Adams, one can point to different periods in American history. But the truth is, it's been very rare, if not non-existent, when we have sort of untethered ourselves from the idea that our foreign policy is rooted in who we are as a people. And I think President Obama tried to express that. We do it because of who we are. And it would be difficult for us to be true to our own founding and our own origins, not to see that this is something that we should champion on everyone's behalf.
So I take it from you and the previous comments that there is a certain core set of American values that are being promoted, but it has to work in a complementary way with sort of the interest, and the context really seems to matter. And I think that goes to what Patrick said earlier about what issues are you talking about, and what are the specific interactions we're looking at. But in general, I think, Jim, your point is that there are these things, and that it actually works as an advantage for U.S. foreign policy. Mike mentioned Asia and some differences in Asia. And so I'd like to turn our attention to Takako and maybe expand a bit and unpackage that from Japan's point of view. Where does Japan stand on this issue of values diplomacy? I know that from some of my readings, Prime Minister Abe, around 2006 or 7, had toyed with this idea a bit. But where's Japan on this issue, and how does it see itself in terms of foreign policy? Do values play an important role? Is it an advantage, disadvantage? Mm-hmm. Yes or no? Why not, if not?
I'm just curious for the wonderful audience who's here at 9:45, whether you have an impression that Japan's diplomacy is very value-driven or not. Who thinks it's very value-driven? Who doesn't think it's value? I think the general impression is that the Japanese diplomacy is not very value-driven. People point out to Japan's pragmatism about right after Tiananmen Square, that Japan was one of the first to restart the relationship with China and so forth. But I think there's three things I want to say. One is that it wasn't that it was completely value devoid, but there was an interesting continuity in that Japan tended to emphasize development over democracy in its policy, and that in itself is some kind of a value in of itself, and that has its legacies even today, even after there's been more active promotion of democracy. Two is that there was something about change in domestic politics and the Cold War that kind of happened pretty much at the same time, that there is a push for Japanese diplomacy to have a slogan. So the substance part, I think there's more continuity, but the slogan is very important, that now the Prime Minister, for domestic political reasons, has to be accountable to the people, and he likes to put his own name on his diplomacy. So there's incentive to call their diplomacy as something. So that's one difference. The other is that I think it wasn't clear right after the Cold War, so Japan went through this Asian values questioning era, and then the human security, and something very different from the previous framework. But then 9/11 came, and it became clear that Japan has to be on one side or the other. It wasn't as almost a given as during the Cold War. And I think that's when we started to see the language of which side Japan is on, which side, the show the flag kind of ness to the values thing. So that's happened pretty much prior to Prime Minister Abe. So what's different about Prime Minister Abe? So if we call the first Abe administration around 2007, Abe 1.0, the value of the famous value-based diplomacy, there was what's called the Arch of Freedom and Prosperity. And I think now they try not to call it the Abe thing. It was by the Finance Minister Aso, so people remember it by the then Foreign Minister Aso. But it was very interesting in that it was an explicit positioning in terms of the values. And although I actually looked back at some documents, he actually made sure not to call it pushing a universal value on some country. He actually goes out of his way to say that it's not, but still there's something about how it was presented that seemed to be a more value-laden thing that people thought was interesting. Yet when it came out, it was criticized heavily that the intent was to contain China. So although the spirit of it, and if you look at the substance of what the policy was in terms of its means in which that was done in terms of development aid and so forth, it wasn't that different from before, that there was still more emphasis on development over democracy and so forth. And it was labeled as something they try not to play it as much. So what's the difference now with Abe 2.0? I think there's a couple of things. One, the context is very different. Now we see China as the alternative player in the region that seems to have its own values in a way, so Japan has to come up with something different. And at the same time, this is more recent, but as of 2016, we have Mr. Trump, who seems to be not that interested in promoting US values in the region. So we're at this point where Japan can't be the US in terms of where they are, the tradition and all that, but there's some understanding that Japan, if it wants to keep the liberal democratic order going in Asia, that Japan has to step up. And so that's where we are. And I guess the free and open Indo-Pacific idea preceded Mr. Trump, but it became more urgent about what it might be. I think after the Trump industry came out and after there was more expectation of Japan to step up. But I guess the important difference of this than before is that there is more emphasis on the democracy aspect of it. And the three pillars of the free and open Indo-Pacific, as I understand, is the rule of law being important, the connectivity, this is more economic, and third is freedom of navigation. So the first and third is somewhat connected, but there's an explicit link of the democracy to the defense capacity building aspects that's done in the region. So in a way, it's a lot more comprehensive policy, but I think that leads to the possible problems with it in terms of the slogan and substance. So if it is going to be more of a show of the flag type of thing, but yet has a very capacity building and military sense connotation to it, is that going to make it difficult for some Asian countries to be more acceptive of Japan's policy because of their fear that it was going to assign something to China? So that's, I think, one, the external slogan part of challenge ahead. And I guess the domestic part of it that is something that you mentioned, Dr. Green, in your piece, is that there's something interesting about Japan's promoters of this concept that tends to be more conservative. Not just that they're LDP, but they tend to come from a very conservative group that tends to kind of go counter to what you have an impression of in Japan as people who fight for human rights and democracy at home. And that's still the case. How do you kind of, how can we structure the way in which maybe, if there is an emphasis on development over democracy, how can we structure aid in a way that it actually, in a substantial way too, Japan does promote democracy? Should there be a difference or change in emphasis if Japan is going to be serious about having the banner of democracy, not just as a slogan, but as a real content of this? So I think that's the challenge ahead, is that whether Japan should be very serious about what they're going to be promoting, not just on whose side they're on, but if they're going to be more interested in democracy. And one like a couple of concrete things. So Japan tends to give money more to governments for state capacity building and not to local actors. Like if you look at the distribution of aid, that is very critical. But as you said, civic groups are very important. So should Japan actually change the substance of policy in promoting democracy? Is that something the way forward? And like this is all, but this has to be all done given the context of, we've been hearing about the Asan public opinion poll, but one thing that's very stark about Japan is the anti-China sentiment. So how does all fit in to, it's so easy to make a China case for promoting a value, but I don't think that's really the way to go. And how do you make this happen or package in a way that is not so starkly anti-China? Because I think for the welfare of Japan in the future, that shouldn't be the way to go in terms of this value-based diplomacy. I think there's more good that can be done in the substance. So how do we come up with a good slogan and have a very substantial policy, which maybe not step up to the level of the US, but try to do something while the US is kind of gone for a while. So thank you.
Patrick, your view, based on your observations in Asia, in general, Takako seems to suggest that Japan's relatively value neutral, but on some specific issues, they could link certain kinds of values to those policy choices. Do you see pockets of these kinds of value-based policymaking when it comes to foreign policy or diplomacy in Asia, or is it in general just overall just relatively value neutral? And if so, why is that?
Well, let me agree with Jim Steinberg that the United States has this unique soft power to use of values that we're not fully using right now. And it is sort of unique to the United States, and it's part of who Americans are, and it's not being fully grasped. Having said that, and putting that idea of exceptionalism aside, it's not really that exceptional in terms of a lot of countries in Europe and even in Asia are very much focused on different types of values diplomacy. In South Korea, there's more being done here through, again, mostly civil society to help North Koreans. And over the years, in terms of those imprisoned, sort of the refugee issue, and human rights. If you think about Taiwan, Japan, I mean, yes, Japan has been focused more on what Jim Steinberg was talking about in terms of economic quality. So the good governance practices of Japan's best civil service and high standards in support for international institutions has done a lot for economic development, including in China, at least historically, not the last few years. Taiwan is an interesting case here. So Tsai Ing-wen is a particular exemplar for a democratic society, but this is a very sensitive case. What is the cross-strait situation? It probably doesn't help that the United States has passed this Taiwan Travel Act, because unfortunately it gives an easy target for the Chinese to attack and look like that we're trying to rewrite the One China policy, which is not the aim, but instead to make sure that the people of Taiwan have the space, the political space, the economic ability to prosper, to have the self-determination, maybe in Mike's word, but it's to come to a peaceful resolution without coercion. And there's a lot that Taiwan's doing as an example, and the exemplar of democracy for the mainland is an important example. And sometimes the power of example is a very good way to contribute. I think in Southeast Asia, you look at a country like Thailand, which had a thriving civil society and democracy, and you just are so saddened by the inability to get back to a democratic roadmap. You look at Singapore, and you think, well, this is sort of the Asian values debate, Kishore Mahbubani in the 90s. Some see that as just overlooking authoritarian government, but really that grew out of a colonial rule and Lee Kuan Yew and good governance and insisting on making sure that the governance really worked for the entire, in this case, island. But there's a lot to those standards, even if they're not democratic values in the same way that they would be in American politics. They've contributed to values in a productive way, by and large, flogging aside. I think you look down in Oceania at Australia, New Zealand, and how they've stood up internationally, not just in the region. And I think Julie Bishop, foreign minister, is proud to be in the UN Human Rights Council for the next 3 years and talking about human rights issues. So I think there are a number of examples. In China as well, for all the disagreements we may have on human rights and democracy, what they're doing on growing middle class and economics can't be ignored. Also, they're cooperating on things like trafficking in women and people. And those getting to some real core fundamental issues. That's essentially 21st century slavery. So that becomes, they can do a lot more. But this is sort of working, you can actually work with every government in the region just about and find somebody who wants to make progress in at least some area.
Jim, Patrick almost did like a very comprehensive overview of almost every country in the region. Did he leave anything out, or do you recall from?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, it's interesting when we talk about this universalism, but even in China, the words are used, right? The Chinese constitution, the Chinese leadership talk about democracy. If you look at Xi Jinping's speech or his work report to the 19th Party Congress, the words are there. And what it reflects is that it's hard to get away from the fact that these are universal values. Now, they can be interpreted in different ways, and I don't think we should be dogmatic about the American version, and especially about, as Mike raised, the Washington Consensus, is sort of the economic features. There are radical versions, which some in the United States adhere to, of economic libertarianism, which I don't share, right? So I think we need to understand that there are different ways to express these things, but that almost nobody says, no, we shouldn't have that. You don't hear the Chinese saying that we shouldn't have these things. And so I think that's where our strength should come from, is to recognize that there are multiple paths to achieve these things, but to understand what's at the root of the ideas about human dignity, about freedom of expression, and things like that, which can be manifested in different ways. And that, I think, is the one thing that gives us an opportunity to have a conversation about these things that crosses through the different countries in the region. And so you don't see anybody sort of saying, no, what we really need is a highly repressive society in which people are told what to think, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so these are all very hopeful messages as we talk about specific issue areas where there could be overlaps and room for cooperation on certain kinds of value-based issues. But let's take a bird's eye view and sort of broaden out a bit. Is there an emerging regional pattern of contending values today, as was the case during the Cold War? Do you see competition of values in the region? If so, what is it? Anyone on the panel?
Well, I'll start if I may. It's not as stark nor as easy as the ideological contest in the Cold War, or the ideological contest in the 30s and during World War II. China is I'm not talking about Russia now, I'm talking about China, but China is part of the international system, a major US trading partner, a major Korean, Japanese trading partner, European trading partner. China's revisionism, to the extent there's revisionism, is much more complicated. And as Patrick and Takako and others have pointed out, within all of our societies, there are huge debates about what democracy means. Jim and I might disagree, for example, on some of the market questions and the role of the market versus the role of government. And that would be a friendly disagreement. I think in Japan there are those who look at Abe and say he's just a neocon. He's using this to justify his right-wing views. And within Korea, I think the polarization of politics means that the democracy word gets used very differently by the Liberty Party and by the Minjudong. And identity is very often about labeling the other side to strengthen your own position. And Takako's right, a certain amount of the Japanese values diplomacy is about distinguishing Japan from China. And as Jim pointed out, there are things, and Patrick, there are things where China would agree with us. I remember President Bush gave a speech at Sophia University in Japan, which I helped write, where he said basically that the democratic norms and rule of law and governance were the key to successful countries like Japan. And he even mentioned Taiwan, and the New York Times and the Washington Post said, oh, it's going to be a disaster when he meets Hu Jintao the next day in China. And they asked Hu Jintao in the press conference, what did you think of the president's speech? And Hu Jintao said, China also wants to be a democracy with Chinese characteristics. So it's overlapping. It's like a very complicated Venn diagram, even within each of our societies and politics, and it's used, by political parties against each other domestically. That said, I think there's a very clear trend line emerging in this region, and I think in Europe in a different way with Russia, that countries and societies that are democracies are increasingly alarmed because they're realizing what's at stake. And I think you can see that in Australia's reaction. The sharp power discussion in another room is getting at this, but I think you see that in Australia's new white paper, the Australian white paper, which talks about value systems and what's at stake for Australia. I think my own version of Japan's growing values diplomacy would be that it's not about 9/11, although that was part of it, but a sense of what's at stake because corporations care about rule of law, worry about coercion. I do think there is an emerging consensus among the democracies that something at stake is under threat. And I think this is even bringing Europe and Japan and the US closer than they've been even a few years ago. And it's exacerbated by the clear evidence that China is now under Xi Jinping trying to export a different model. So when I forget who said, no country wants to sign up for authoritarianism, well, Xi Jinping is putting out Xi Jinping thought and propagating in different countries that there's an alternative model. Putin's doing that in a different way, in a much more threatening way. So I do think, although it's not blue and red, I do think there is a growing sense among democracies that something fundamentally of value is at stake right now. Now, how we operationalize that, that's much more complicated. Japan has not figured out fully how to operationalize it. Korea hasn't either.
If I could just add, I mean, I think I partially agree with Mike's characterization here, but I think that when we think about the Chinese advocacy of the alternative model, it's different from the Soviet Union, which not only thought that it had something else to offer, but thought everybody should do it. And I think there is a difference. I do not think the Chinese are saying, you must do it our way, that this is the only way to do it. I think they are proposing an alternative model, and I think we have to take that seriously. But it isn't two universalist models competing with each other. I think the Chinese would be perfectly happy for other countries in the region, Korea, Japan, to keep their current model, as long as they didn't threaten China's security and conform to China's other direct interests. And I think the competition here is much more of a competition about how countries are, and particularly China, is trying to achieve its own security at the expense of others, which is deeply troubling and a problem we have to deal with, as opposed to a deliberate, sort of affirmatively exporting its model. I think part of the reason it talks about the alternative model is it wants to undercut the universalism of what we're doing, because if the Chinese model isn't at least as good, then it's hard for China to explain why it should subsist with its own. But I think that there's a danger of converting this into the ideological competition of the Cold War as opposed to a zero-sum competition on interest, which is developing in a fairly worrisome way between us, and China just using this idea, well, there are different models, basically to undercut the moral high ground from the United States, which is, again, comes back to my point about why I'm concerned about the current administration, because we're just playing into their hands in that respect.
One place where I disagree with Jim on this is in Southeast Asia, and that's where democracy is definitely on the run. There's a democracy deficit already. It's unusual. We heard, of course, from my friend Dino Jalal today about Indonesia's success, but they're really the exception in Southeast Asia. Big exception, but nonetheless very difficult to compete with China's creeping influence and rules and institutions that they would like to build. This is part of a global trend as well, though, in terms of democracy in retreat. Freedom House, the last 12 years, democracies in retreat. There are other data that show, again, that the last 5 years in particular, there are more countries that have been backsliding from democracy than actually moving ahead. That's a democratic recession.
But Patrick, I just say, I mean, I don't think there's a danger that we're going to kind of blame China for Viktor Orban, and I mean, you're right, there's a democratic retreat, no doubt. I mean, all the things that we've said, but the question is this because China is successful in promoting its alternative model, or is it because of the problems that have been troubling democracy?
China's exploiting it and making it worse.
Right, and in Southeast Asia is one of the ripest places where they're doing that. You're right, Jim, I don't want to overstate it, and I slid into the separate issue, you're right, because it's a late night, it's easy to do.
No, but I think that's an important point to think about when we think about why Japan is doing what it's doing. Is because clearly, I mentioned 9/11, not to say that it's driving now. I think at that moment that mattered, but now what's driving the emphasis on democracy/development, more values-based in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific is there's a sense of if Japan doesn't do anything and there's going to be some democratic backsliding and China's going to take over, how are you going to have the safe of passage to have what we need to pass through that area to keep Japan going? So there's a sense if we don't do something, and that leads to the packaging of capacity building with sort of defense and also the language of democracy, precisely because that's what they're really concerned about. And so I guess the question going ahead is that you mentioned operationally, it's very hard, like what exactly could Japan do to prevent China from taking advantage from countries that are already having trouble is actually very difficult. And the other question is if we're going to try to do something, is it actually better to stick to what Japan has always done, which kind of looks weirdly like the Chinese model, that there's more emphasis on development than democracy, provide support to state institutions, empower the state institutions, and to sort of reluctance to take a stand. That altogether looks more Chinese than democratic, or should we kind of change our position and say, well, we're not doing that anymore. What we're going to do is empower.
Can I just say that we have to be careful not to stereotype the American policy on this
right,
either.
right,
I mean,
right.
if you look at what happens in this region, for example, you have Radio Free Asia, I'm on their board, which is more revolutionary, but you also have the Asia
Right.
Foundation, I'm on their board, which works within China, within Vietnam,
Right.
with state institutions.
Right, right, exactly.
The American Bar Association. So there's a whole
Right.
panoply of institutions in the U.S. that work across
Right.
the spectrum.
Yeah.
Some are, much more revolutionary.
Right. It's just that I was
Others
looking-
are more working with institutions.
Right.
But your big point, I think, is right. Japan doesn't have to do it the way the U.S. does it.
Right.
There are areas on that spectrum where Japan can
Right.
play a role.
Right.
So, for example, the Japanese government's, I think, increasingly looking at training technocrats in procurement and
And local
public
government
works,
and all that, yeah.
which would be good governance, rule of law type of work.
It's just that I mentioned the state institution part because when you look at how development aid is distributed, Japan is actually very starkly through request-based by state institutions. It's extremely rare. And so that's one thing that I wanted to point out. But you're right that it's not that Japan's exception about that. But still, I think the issue is what we do to make it doesn't have to be one model at all, and what's the most effective way. And I think Japan cannot be the U.S. in various ways. Japan cannot be China in various ways. So it's just finding what exactly can be done is very tricky in coming up with the values diplomacy. And I guess it's just that I thought I took part in a class that was partly taught by Kishore Mahbubani at Columbia this semester. So we went through this whole what does Asia want kind of a discussion. And I guess not to make stark choices, if that's important, how exactly to put that together with the value kind of component of diplomacy is going to be kind of tricky going forward.
Well, this is all, things are heating up, and I think we're getting, we could go on for a very long time, but I wanted to give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions. So we'll take some questions from the floor if there's any. I see 3 hands, so let's go in this order. We'll take 3 questions first, and then we'll do a round of answers. How's that?
Thank you to the speakers and to Asan for organizing this fascinating late session here. To bring things much more close to home here, obviously everyone's focused on what's going to happen on Friday with the Inter-Korean Summit and going forward with a possible Kim-Trump summit. And crossing our fingers if things move well and there's progress on the denuclearization objective, we're nevertheless going to run into a conundrum that's directly related to the debate or discussion they're having tonight, which is values diplomacy, and how would that apply in our engagement with North Korea. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts on that front. This goes directly to a question of prioritizing interests and so forth, and how do we deal with it and so forth. So in a very practical case, what would your advice to the Blue House or the White House or the Conte be on this kind of thing? Thank you.
Second question in the back of the room. Second question to the gentleman in the back, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for fascinating discussion about value. I'm not asking question, but I want to share some sort of views from particularly Southeast Asian countries. I thought I'm teaching at the International University of Japan. The fall term, I had 28 students, 7 from Eurasia, 7 from Africa, 7 from ASEAN, 7 from Japan and the United States. And at the beginning, I asked them what is your threat perception? And please make groups agreed upon a list of national security threat from top to 5. And the US-Japan team, of course, Chinese rise and North Korean missile programs and climate change sort of thing. African students, corruption of the government. And that sort of thing, diseases. And ASEAN country, the first was, the highest was Rohingya crisis. And second one was very, very interesting, foreign intervention. So, and that implies me big powers like China or the United States. They don't want to be intervened. In that sense, when we discuss the things with the students, the language is sounded very much important as we proceed to the discussion. Sometimes I felt like English is not necessarily a good language to communicate with the ASEAN people. But more, if we have more indirect usage of English language, we will be better off in communicating with them.
Third question, and then we'll go to answers.
I'd like to know, if not for universal values, at least there used to be some consensual markers or at least common denominators, but all this is going down the drain like everything except maybe, of course, the swamp. And I wanted to know if you see other ways of conveying values, even without mentioning them, or like in a cryptid or edulcorated way, like through the EPA, under Prout, they are banning the use of certain words, but somehow trying to do you see this under what's left of the DOS as well, or other ways of promoting, but through different language?
Okay, so I did have a question that was related, but I'm going to save it for the last. So let's, who wants to take the one on engagement with North Korea? Well, how should we prioritize values when it comes to engagement with North Korea?
I'd certainly like to say a few words about that. I'm reluctant to give advice to President Moon Jae-in, who is a human rights and justice lawyer. So he knows a lot about these issues and cares, I think, about them. I think his approach, as it's been explained to me, is to just understand that this has to be a longer process. It's only a matter of time. So it's only a matter of when you get to some of these fundamental issues of the human rights problems and issues, but they have to be dealt with. But if you try to deal with everything first step, you'll never get to a second step, a third step, and a fourth step. I think that's been the same logic that's been given to Prime Minister Abe, whether he's been satisfied with that or whether he felt that's why he had to get more of a pledge from, I think, President Trump, saying, no, we must raise the issue, even if we recognize it can't dominate the first summit meeting. I think one of the issues where you cannot sort of punt on the human rights issues is on humanitarian aid, because this is often mentioned as one of the very first deliverables that can be given to North Korea. The problem with that, the moral hazard of that, is that we're tying it to steps on denuclearization and peace, and that's against humanitarian principles. So, ironically, we could get tripped up right away, even just over a debate on whether our humanitarian aid is, we'll do it anyhow, or we'll have a green light for South Korea to deliver or others do it. But it does create a moral hazard for the countries that are worried about these issues, because you don't want, humanitarian aid should be given on the basis of need, not on the basis of high politics, even though high politics trumps most other things, forgive the word. In this case, it shouldn't. It's only a matter of whether you can get access and whether you can assure that it's going to the people in need. And those are the real factors that should limit. And there's a whole set of specific principles that you probably know about. So it's the humanitarian aid that may be the immediate issue. We're going to have to get human rights on the agenda very soon, and presumably as part of a peace process that could come out as early as this Friday in terms of being announced that they're going to talk about the peace dimension. And the peace will be part of a package deal with denuclearization if this all goes to sort of pre-summit plans, big if, but if they did, then you'd have to put human rights somewhere in that basket of issues to be discussed. Now, how quickly they get to it in reality is anybody's guess.
Okay, Jim?
So
Sir.
one of the things I've learned in a number of years of doing diplomacy is that no government has ever agreed to take measures which is confident will lead to its own demise, right? And it doesn't matter how effective your coercion is, because if they're going to lose anyway, they might as well resist you. And so if we think that there's somehow a kind of a coercive strategy, even for small countries, that's going to lead to improvement in human rights if they perceive this as regime threatening, we're not going to succeed. And it's one of the reasons I got asked earlier by some of the members of the press corps here about how can you imagine normalization with North Korea absent significant improvement in human rights. I think of the opposite way. I think the only chance of getting an improvement in human rights is for us to demonstrate that we don't have a regime-trained strategy. We may despise the regime. We do despise it. We should despise the regime. But we're not going to get anywhere with the regime if they're convinced that that's our goal. And you know, I think it was my own experience in doing human rights dialogue with China over 2 administrations, is that you can't not talk about it, but if your strategy is to do it in ways that are seen by the other side as basically trying to undermine the regime itself, they're just not going to acquiesce. And we have a lot of leverage. I'm not suggesting that we don't, but we have to understand what leverage works for and when it doesn't. So I think we need to keep it on the agenda. We learned that lesson from the Helsinki agreements. It was really quite extraordinary, and I think we forget how extraordinary that was. What happened in 1975, against concerns by human rights groups and others, was we accepted, not with enthusiasm or taste, the de facto status of the regimes, including in the Soviet Union and its satellites in Eastern Europe. But by including the third basket in Helsinki, we got that because we accepted the regimes as legitimate in the political sense, although not in the moral sense. And the long-run impact was quite positive. So I think we need to learn that lesson as we deal with North Korea, to make sure, as Patrick was suggesting, that there is a third basket on these dialogues, but to make sure that we separate that from the question of the regime change strategy.
Jim, you'd probably agree, we can incentivize it, though. So even
Absolutely.
the potential release of the
of
3
course.
Americans being held is a gesture, but still it shows how
absolutely.
we're making him not only save face, but look like he's doing goodwill
absolutely.
by releasing them if this happens.
I guess the comment and the question somewhat could be linked on the second question, which is about how to, I guess, communicate and talk about this issue and frame the issue of values. And if it's not some sort of greater, this very big universal value, the way I understood you to say is specifically about specific norms, perhaps? Was that what you were referring to? I didn't quite.
I think his point was, if I understood it, and I agree with it, is that economic partnership agreements, free trade agreements, TPP, is another way to advance democratic norms without, which incentivizes the country in question. And one of the many reasons it was foolish for the U.S. to pull out of TPP was because Vietnam, for example, in order to attract what would be enormous investment as a member of TPP, investment away from China, was going to have to make some significant moves. Some Democrats in Congress said not enough, but nevertheless, very significant moves on labor rights. And so, yes, EPAs, FTAs can be, if that's your point, can be an important part and should be an important part of the overall strategy. And in particular, when a country does an EPA with the EU or an FTA with the US, and our big companies invest, they're held accountable at home by civil society and are pushed to use best practices in these countries. So if I understood your point correctly, maybe that's not your point. I think it's an important part of the strategy. On North Korea, don't worry. It will be a huge success Friday. President Moon will tell us all it's a huge success because it has to be. He and Kim Jong-un can't afford any other outcome, regardless of the content. Then Donald Trump will meet with Kim Jong-un, and that's the real question mark. What happens in that one? And what I've seen in 25 years of doing this with North Korea, but also from the North Koreans' announcement, there's nothing verifiable. Kim Jong-un will very possibly, go for this peace mechanism. I think Jim and Patrick framed it right. I would keep human rights on the agenda from day one, but I wouldn't make it a showstopper. But make it very clear at some point it will be a showstopper. The problem is the North Koreans will say that, and I've heard this in Pyongyang, they'll say that's hostile policy, you have to end your hostile policy. One of the 3 or 4 points they always raise is you have to stop criticizing our regime, and we should not accept that. And it's very, very important in my view that not only the US and the ROK, but the EU and other countries have a unified position on this. Because I was in charge of talking to the North Koreans about human rights in 2002 when we went to Pyongyang. And Kim Dae-gwan said, no, you don't understand. Everyone in our regime is very happy. And of course, we made no progress. But we noticed that at the same time, the EU began ramping up its criticism of North Korean human rights, and we knew that got their attention. And it also got China's attention. And on issues like refoulement, the forced return of refugees to North Korea, the Chinese pay attention when the US, EU, Japan, Canada, are speaking with one voice. So I not a showstopper, but we should keep it front and center, and we should make it a broadly held view of all the countries that are going to be engaging North Korea going forward.
We have time for one last question. If there aren't any, I'm going to end with my last question, and each of you have to answer it. So, so we kind of talked about this. We face a world now with a U.S. that is the America First driven policy. What would you recommend that the leaders of this region do in response to that? I think Takako kind of raised this issue with respect to Japan, but if you can make recommendations to President Moon or Prime Minister Abe, what would you recommend that they do about this? Wait it out. Mike, you talked about the importance of things like TPP. U.S. walked out of it, and now they're considering back in, but then maybe not. It's a mistake. Whether it was a mistake or it wasn't, from the U.S. point of view, that's what it is. But for the countries in the region who are faced with this reality, what would you recommend the leaders of the countries in this region do? And let's go with, since Takako has thought about this a bit in Japan, let's start with you. And would you make recommendations to Prime Minister Abe on this?
So it actually follows up on the last question, that I think Japan's policy was to just keep the institutions going, because that in itself was maintaining a certain type of order without really labeling as something. And I would say that let's keep these institutions alive and maybe be low-key if that's the more effective way to do it. And I guess the important question becomes, if Mr. Trump does decide he wants to re-enter, to what extent Japan should actually put that as a priority rather than to just go on with what they have. That will be the big challenge, and I don't have a position on that. And I guess just for a cautionary tale, I'm kind of worried about how the word democracy is sort of, you mentioned in the 2009 article that it actually worked kind of like an ideational glue if Japan wants to align with India and Australia. But the downside of it is it sounds kind of cheap when you start using it as demo. It's like, is that the only thing you can find in common with India and Australia, or are you just going to paste it on? And I think you kind of have to be careful about how you want to present what you're doing. Like, are you going to take a very functional approach and say, well, we're doing it because we need to do it? And just to avoid to use the word China, you don't want to just call it a democracy thing out of the blue, because it sounds really cheap and dishonest. So I would rather see while the US is kind of gone, or when we have to work on working with other allies to just get the system going, but not to go overboard and trying to paint it as if it's one grand something happening, because it's kind of a tortured way to put things together, but do what it can in a low-key way, because Japan is not really trying to make Japan great again in the process. They're just trying to hang on to what they have towards 2025, and I think it's very misleading if it sounds like we're going to try something new in Asia. So I personally recommend a more low-key, no excessive sloganing, but maybe a little bit more emphasis on empowering maybe non-state actors as necessary, but kind of stick to what it does best.
Jim?
I think we all puzzle at the question about what, if anything, influences President Trump in terms of how he sees the world and develops his policy. But I think it's incumbent on our friends and partners in Asia and Europe and Latin America and elsewhere just to be clear to the president, not in a hostile or contentious way, but about why this is important and why their ability to sustain the relationship with the United States depends on the United States continuing to remain committed to these things. I think they need to to not give it a pass on the theory that, somehow if you just kind of don't raise these concerns, that President Trump will be more responsive to you. Because I worry it's the opposite, that if our partners don't make these points and don't raise them, that the president will just assume that it's okay, and you can get away with the strategy that says, what have you done for me lately, which seems to animate his calculus. So I think we need to hear some of this. I think the strategy that Chancellor Merkel and others have used is important to make clear that they value the partnership with the United States. It is indispensable for all of us, but that it is rooted in values and these kinds of things that must be sustained. And I think that over the long run, that's important, because it's not just important for countries here to get along with President Trump. It's to sustain the relationship with the United States.
Patrick?
Well, I think Korea, Japan, other countries in the region can definitely pursue functional areas in trade, non-proliferation, the maritime commons, and freedom of navigation, all of those functional areas, but they can go beyond that where they're comfortable in terms of talking about violations of human rights and things that offend their values, whether it's Tibet and Xinjiang or Taiwan or Hong Kong, just to pick on China, because China's the big kid on the block whose values are largely challenging the liberal international order. Even if there's not an ideological direct fight, I think there's an indirect one, and it's more surreptitious and 21st century one. But it is definitely a contest, and they can press on that. But I agree with Jim Steinberg that they should definitely be letting the President of the United States know that the United States is missing an opportunity to have more traditional influence in ways that doesn't cost the United States a lot, but we're giving up a tool at a time when we're desperately looking for strategic influence, and we're throwing away a tool that has been historically just not only a core value for us, but absolutely essential.
And Mike, you get the last word.
So the common denominator of which leaders Donald Trump likes would be in two categories: leaders with big military parades, Macron, Xi Jinping, and Putin, or leaders who play golf, Abe. So Moon Jae-in is not going to be able to learn golf in time, so he'd better get the Ministry of Defense working on a really impressive Bastille Day type of parade. That's actually accurate, but I am saying it half in jest. I think to your question about what friends and allies who have a stake, a major stake in the American-led, order should do. One is to remember that the founding fathers created a system of checks and balances to prevent a dictator. And so if you live in Washington, so you know, James, but if you go to Congress, for example, if you talk to state governors, civil society leaders, they are more global than ever. Polls show that since the 2016 election, the number of Americans who think global engagement is good has gone up. The majority support free trade. The number of Americans who support defending Japan or Korea if they're attacked is gone up. So America's a big, messy country, and there's a lot more to it than just the inhabitant of 1600 Pennsylvania, although when Dan and I were in the White House, we never admitted that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think that history proves that when countries have a stake in the American-led order and America goes a little bit astray, standing together matters. When Jimmy Carter was going to pull troops off the Korean Peninsula, it was Japan that came in to Washington and said, don't do that. When the Clinton administration was beating up China and human rights, which China deserved, but that was the totality of their policy, it was the EU and Japan and others who came in and said, don't do that. So when allies who share our values coordinate, it can have an impact. It can have an impact. And there are plenty of institutions and members of the American Congress, civil society, who will amplify that. And even members of the administration who will amplify that.
Well, it's certainly an interesting hour and a half or so, where I certainly learned a lot about values diplomacy and the intricacies of this issue and how sophisticated we should approach this problem. It's a very complex issue, and there's a lot to be learned there. And I hope you have a good evening tonight. and get up early for tomorrow morning's first session. I want to thank the panelists for a very enlightening discussion. Thank you.